I still remember the exact moment she raised her voice at me, not because it was loud, but because it was effortless, like I was already beneath the level where respect was required. I had asked a simple question, why I wasn't invited to her family function, not in anger, not in accusation, just a question a man asks when he starts noticing he is being kept outside the frame of a life he thought he was part of. She didn't even look at me when she answered. Then she laughed, that short, dismissive laugh that doesn't belong to humor, it belongs to superiority. "You want to come to everything now?" she said. I stayed quiet for a moment, because silence tells you things people will never say twice. I watched her go back to her phone, scrolling like my presence was background noise. That was the first crack, not in her voice, in something inside me that used to justify everything. Later that evening, we were sitting in her apartment, the same apartment I had helped move furniture into, the same walls I had once believed I might belong to. She was talking about the family function again, dresses, food, music, names I wasn't part of, and every sentence felt like a door closing quietly in my direction. I asked again, softer this time, "Is there a reason I can't come?" That was when her tone changed, not louder, sharper. "You are making it weird," she said. "It's just family. Not everything is about you." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I was starting to understand something I didn't want to. People don't always push you away with force. Sometimes they just stop including you and wait for you to leave yourself. I looked around her living room, familiar objects, shared moments, a life that looked mutual from a distance but felt increasingly one-sided up close. She stood up to go to the kitchen, already done with the conversation. That was when she shouted, not because I provoked her, but because my silence made her uncomfortable. "Why are you acting like this is some big issue?" she snapped. "You always do this. You overthink everything." I didn't respond, because I realized something important in that moment. Arguments are not always about truth. Sometimes they are about permission, and I was no longer being given permission to question anything. She left the room, still talking, words fading into the sound of running water in the kitchen sink. I sat there, staring at the space she had just occupied, and I felt it. Not heartbreak, not anger, something quieter, distance forming without movement. That night she acted normal again. She made tea, asked me if I wanted some, smiled like nothing had happened, and I said yes, because that is what I had been trained to do. Accept the version of reality that requires the least resistance. But something had already shifted. I noticed how she didn't wait for my reply before deciding things, how she spoke about plans that excluded me as if I was already understood to be absent, how easily I was replaced in conversations that used to belong to us. And I started doing something I had never done before. I stopped explaining myself, not out of pride, out of observation, because I wanted to see what would remain when I stopped participating in my own dismissal. The answer came slowly, in small moments, in pauses that weren't filled anymore, in invitations that never arrived, and in the way she stopped noticing the difference between me being there and not being there. That was the beginning, not of an ending, but of clarity, and clarity changes everything, even when nothing else changes at first. She started preparing for the family function like I wasn't part of the equation at all. I watched her choose outfits in front of the mirror, turning slightly, asking her own reflection for approval instead of me. At one point, she asked, "Does this look good?" Not to me, just into the room. And I answered anyway. It does, because I still thought participation might keep me relevant. But I was wrong. The more I agreed, the less I existed. There was a moment, small and almost invisible, when she looked at her phone while I was speaking, not once, not occasionally, consistently, like I was audio playing in a room she no longer needed to listen to. I remember standing near the door that night before leaving, not leaving her, just leaving the version of me that kept trying to be included. She didn't notice immediately. That was the strange part. Absence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it tests how long it takes to be recognized. Minutes passed, then more, and still nothing. No question, no search, no interruption in her routine. And I understood something that didn't feel dramatic at all. It felt final, that I had become optional without anyone needing to declare it. I walked out quietly, not as a reaction, but as an observation made physical. The street outside felt normal, too normal for what had just ended inside me. I didn't check my phone, not because I was strong, but because I didn't want confirmation of what I already knew. That night, I didn't sleep immediately. I lay there thinking about how relationships don't always break loudly. Sometimes they just stop recognizing you, and you're the last one to notice. By the morning, nothing had changed on the surface. She still hadn't called my name differently, still hadn't asked me where I was when I wasn't beside her. But I had changed in a way that couldn't be reversed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like something inside me had stepped back far enough to see the full picture clearly for the first time, without needing permission anymore. And I knew I would never go back to being unseen again, not after this, ever. I didn't go back the next day. Not because I was trying to make a statement, but because something in me had already stopped negotiating with comfort. The morning felt ordinary in a way that irritated me. Sunlight through a window, distant traffic, the kind of normal that pretends nothing important has changed. But something had changed. I could feel it in the silence where my name used to be called. At first, I told myself she would notice, that she would call, that she would ask where I went after I left so quietly. Hours passed, then a full day. Nothing. No missed calls that mattered, no message that carried weight, just the usual noise of a life that continued without adjusting for my absence. That was when I understood the difference between being loved and being tolerated. Love searches for you. Tolerance waits for you to return on your own. I started walking more that week. Not for exercise, not for clarity, but because movement kept me from sitting in the same thought too long. Every street looked familiar but felt unrelated to me, like I was passing through someone else's memory. On the third day, I received a message. Not from her, from her cousin. It was casual at first, a question about something unrelated, something small enough to feel safe. Then another message followed. "You okay? Natalie said you left suddenly." I stared at the screen longer than I should have, because the wording mattered. Not concern, not confusion, narrative management. I didn't reply. Instead, I placed the phone face down and let the silence answer for me. That evening, I found myself outside a cafe we used to go to. Not intentionally. My feet had simply remembered before I did. I stood across the street for a while, watching people move in and out, laughing in ways that didn't require explanation. I didn't go in. There was no emotional climax, just a quiet decision not to re-enter spaces where I had already been reduced. A week later, she finally called. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the screen light up, her name appearing like it still belonged to something inside me. Then I let it ring out. She called again, and again, then stopped. A message followed. "Can we talk? You're acting strange." Strange. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. Because nothing I had done felt strange. It felt delayed, like something that should have happened earlier but finally caught up to reality. I didn't respond. Not out of punishment, but because I had started to notice something important. Every explanation I used to give only extended the conversation that never changed the outcome, and I was tired of participating in loops disguised as dialogue. 2 days later, I saw a photo. Not sent to me, it appeared through someone else's story. A gathering. Her family function. She was there, dressed carefully, smiling carefully, and beside her stood someone I recognized immediately. her ex. The version of her past she had once described as irrelevant. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable for someone who was supposed to be out of her life. I stared at the image longer than I intended, not because it hurt in the way people assume, but because it clarified something I had been refusing to name. I had not been replaced suddenly. I had been replaced gradually, in places I wasn't invited to notice. I closed the app, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to ask why, because the answer was already visible. That night, she called again. This time, I answered. Not to speak, just to listen. Her voice came through carefully at first, measured, controlled, like she was entering a room she had already rehearsed. "You're making this bigger than it is," she said. I stayed quiet. She continued. "You didn't have to leave like that. You could have just talked." There it was again, the rewriting. Not of events, but of scale, as if leaving quietly was more dramatic than being slowly excluded. I still didn't respond. She exhaled sharply. Then her tone shifted, frustration breaking through the performance. "Why are you like this now?" And I realized she wasn't asking me. She was trying to restore the version of me that used to explain things until they became acceptable again. But that version wasn't available anymore. I ended the call without saying a word. The silence after it felt different. Not heavy, clean. Over the next few days, I began sorting through my own space. Not packing in urgency, just removing noise. Objects, habits, small reminders that kept old patterns alive. Nothing dramatic. No music, no emotion amplified from meaning, just decisions made without discussion. Every item I removed felt like a sentence I was no longer willing to continue writing. By the end of the week, the apartment looked unchanged to anyone else, but it no longer echoed with participation. Then came the message I didn't expect. From her sister. "I don't know what happened between you two, but she's not doing well." I read it once, then again, and closed it. Because I had learned something by then. Concern delivered after exclusion is not concern. It is observation after control has failed. I didn't reply. That night, I booked a short-term place across the city. Not because I was running, but because staying had started to feel like participation in a story I was no longer part of. When I arrived, I unpacked quickly. Clothes, essentials, nothing symbolic. Everything fit into space that felt too large for how little I needed now. That should have felt empty. Instead, it felt accurate. Later, I stood by the window and watched a city that didn't know my name. And for the first time, that felt like relief instead of absence. I didn't know what came next, but I knew what had already ended. And that was enough for now. I stayed in the short-term apartment longer than I planned, not because I was lost, but because nothing was pulling me back anymore. The silence from her side had stopped feeling like waiting. It had started feeling like confirmation. Each day followed the same pattern. Wake up, walk, think less than yesterday. And slowly even thoughts of her stopped arriving with urgency. They came later, weaker, distant, like echoes from a room I had already left behind. Then the messages changed again. First soft, "I don't understand why you're doing this." Then frustrated, then accusing, then nothing. And every cycle told me the same thing. She wasn't trying to reach me, she was trying to reset me, back into the version that responded, that explained, that stayed. I didn't return. Not anymore. A week later, I noticed something small. Our shared streaming account had been altered. Profile renamed, history reset, recommendations erased. A quiet attempt to rewrite shared space. I stared at it for a long time. Not angry, just observant. Even after distance, control still tries to find shape. I changed the password, not as revenge, as finality. No message sent, no explanation given, just access denied. That same night, I opened the cloud album we once shared. Photos that used to feel like proof of something real. Now they looked like documentation of a phase. I didn't delete everything, only what kept me emotionally anchored to a version of myself I no longer recognized. Then I stopped, because erasing everything felt like denial. And I didn't want denial. I wanted accuracy. Days passed. Then her message came again. Different this time. Empty. You don't care at all, do you? I read it once, then closed it. Because caring was never the question. Control was, and that had already ended. I started focusing on work applications, not as escape, as direction. New city, new role, new distance from everything that kept pulling me backward. Interviews came slowly, then faster. Each one made the future less imaginary, more physical, something I could step into. Meanwhile, her messages became unstable. Long paragraphs one night, silence the next, then anger again. And I noticed something. Absence affected her differently than it affected me. For me, it clarified. For her, it collapsed things she relied on. Then came a late call. I answered without speaking. A pause. Then her voice, smaller than before. You changed everything. I didn't respond. She continued, I can't explain this to my family. There it was again, the audience, not me, not us, the people she needed to maintain a version of reality for. I stayed silent. She exhaled, then asked softly, was I really that easy to leave? That question should have pulled something from me. It didn't, because it was based on the wrong assumption. I didn't leave easily. I left after realizing I had already been excluded long before I walked out. I ended the call. No explanation, no comfort, just silence. The next morning, I signed lease termination papers. The apartment we once shared, technically mine, she never completed her name on it, always saying she would handle it later. Later never came. Now it didn't matter. The notice was clean, legal, final. No emotion attached, just structure replacing confusion. When I sent it, I felt nothing dramatic. No satisfaction, no anger, just completion. Later, I received confirmation. She seemed surprised. I closed the email. Because surprise only exists where expectation is never challenged, and I had stopped living inside expectations I didn't set. 2 days later, I heard she went to the apartment, screaming, calling my name, demanding answers from empty rooms. I wasn't there, and that mattered more than anything she could say, because absence becomes louder when it is intentional. I was already gone. Not physically, structurally, removed from systems she still assumed included me. I moved cities quietly. No announcement, no confrontation, just relocation of identity. The new place carried no memory, only neutrality. And neutrality felt like the closest thing to peace I had known for a long time. I unpacked slowly the first night, not because I needed time, but because I wanted to see what I still chose to carry. Everything fit, easier than expected. That should have felt strange. It didn't. It felt correct. I stood in the center of the room after finishing. No phone, no messages, no narrative outside my control. Just silence. And for the first time, silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like ownership. I sat down and wrote one sentence. I am no longer where I used to be. Then I stopped, because anything beyond that would have been explanation, and I was done explaining. Not to her, not to anyone, just done. By the time the lease termination was processed, I had already stopped expecting any reaction that made sense. Still, the message came. Not from her directly at first, from noise around her, mutual friends, indirect updates, fragmented versions of a story I was no longer participating in. She's saying she didn't know it was ending. That line stayed with me for a moment, not because it was surprising, but because it was predictable. People rarely remember what they agreed to ignore. I didn't respond, because response was still a form of participation, and I had already exited that system. A few days later, she called again. Different number, same pattern. I let it ring. Then again, and again, until it stopped being urgent and became familiar background noise. Then a voicemail. Her voice was different this time. Not angry, not rehearsed, just unstable. You can't just erase everything like this. I listened once, deleted it, because erasing is not what had happened. Recognition had simply stopped. I was walking through a new part of the city when her sister messaged again, this time longer. She's not sleeping. She keeps asking what she did wrong. I stared at it while standing at a crosswalk. People moved around me like I was part of the scenery. I didn't reply, because that question had already been answered too many times while I was still present. I crossed the street and kept walking. Later that night, I saw another post indirectly. A photo. Her sitting at the same apartment, the one I had left. Same couch, same lighting, but something missing in the framing. Me. The caption said nothing important, but the image did. It was an attempt to restore normality through repetition. I closed it, because watching someone rebuild illusion is still involvement, and I was no longer involved. The next morning, I received legal confirmation. Lease fully closed. Account separation complete. No shared obligations remaining. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. It felt like finishing paperwork for something that had already died earlier than anyone admitted. That afternoon, I moved the last of my belongings. Boxes were lighter than expected, not because I had little, but because I had already let go of most of it internally. The new apartment was smaller, quieter, more honest in its emptiness. I placed my bag down and stood in the center of the room. No sound, no interruption, just space. Then my phone rang. Her name. I answered this time, but said nothing. She spoke immediately, faster than usual. I just want to understand why you did all this. I waited, not for her to finish, but for her to realize I wasn't going to translate anything anymore. She continued, "You didn't even give me a chance to fix it." That sentence landed differently, because it assumed there had been a shared system still functioning when I left. There hadn't been. Fixing only applies when both sides are still maintaining the structure. I finally spoke, not emotionally, not coldly, just clearly. There was nothing left to fix. Silence followed. Then her voice softened. "You're acting like I never mattered." I closed my eyes for a moment, because that wasn't true. She had mattered. That was the problem. She mattered while I was still present, not after I was removed. "I didn't leave suddenly," I said. "I left after I stopped being included." She didn't respond immediately. Then a shift. "You're punishing me." I shook my head even though she couldn't see it. "No." Another pause. Then she whispered, "Do you miss me at all?" That question should have reopened something. It didn't, because missing someone requires a version of them that still exists somewhere in shared reality. Ours had already split. "I miss what I thought it was," I said. "Not her, not us, just the idea." She went quiet, long enough for the silence to become the real conversation. Then she said something quieter. "I didn't think you would actually leave." And there it was, the core assumption, that presence was permanent, that silence was temporary, that boundaries were negotiable. I didn't respond, because anything I said after that would have been explanation again. An explanation was the trap I had already escaped. The call ended without closure, just disconnect. No resolution, only distance. After that, days passed without contact, then weeks. The absence no longer felt active. It felt normal, like a background state I had adapted to. At work, things improved. Focus sharpened. Decisions became easier, not because life was better, but because it was no longer split between presence and expectation. One evening, I received one final message, not from her, from her mother. It was polite, careful, the kind of message written after emotional narratives had already failed. "We hope you are well. Natalie is learning from this." I read it once, then put the phone down, because learning implies understanding, and understanding requires truth to be accepted without resistance. I wasn't part of their version of resolution, and I didn't need to be. That night I walked for a long time. No destination, just movement. The city felt larger than before, or maybe I had stopped shrinking inside it. At some point I stopped near a bridge, water moving below without awareness of observation. I stood there for a while, not thinking about her, not thinking about absence, just existing without reference. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I turned back eventually, not because anything pulled me back, but because I was no longer looking for something behind me. I went home, closed the door, and didn't check if anything was missing, because I already knew the answer. That was the moment I understood peace was not something I found in people or places, but something that appeared when I stopped expecting anything from either and finally allowed my life to continue without permission from the past anymore. Nothing called me back into the version of myself that needed approval to exist, and I was no longer waiting for life to give me permission to move forward because I had already started living beyond it completely.
A month passed without anything from her. No calls, no messages, no indirect attempts through other people. At first I noticed the silence. Then I adapted to it. And eventually I stopped measuring time by her absence. Life didn't become exciting overnight. It became stable, predictable in a way that didn't feel empty. Work filled most of my days, not as a distraction, but as something that finally belonged only to me. No divided attention, no emotional negotiations running in the background, just focus, and the quiet satisfaction of progress that didn't depend on anyone's approval. People around me started noticing small changes, not dramatic ones, subtle things. "You seem different. You look lighter." I didn't explain, because the change wasn't something I could summarize in conversation. It was built in silence, in decisions no one saw, in moments where I chose not to go back. One evening, I received a message, a name I hadn't expected. Bryce, her ex. I stared at it for a moment before opening it, not curiosity, just acknowledgement. His message was simple. "I think I understand now." I didn't reply immediately. I read it again, trying to understand what he meant by that. Another message followed. "She talked about you more than she ever admitted." I leaned back in my chair, not reacting, just observing. Then the final line came. "I wasn't replacing you. I was competing with someone who was already gone." That was the first honest sentence connected to that entire situation, and it didn't come from her. I didn't respond. There was nothing to add, because clarity doesn't require conversation. It stands on its own. I closed the message and placed my phone down. Whatever dynamic existed between them no longer involved me, and that separation felt complete. Later that week, I received something unexpected. A package. No return address, no message, just my name written in handwriting I recognized instantly. I opened it slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I already knew what it might contain. Inside was a photo. The one from Charleston, the one I had left behind on the counter. Now it was torn in half, cleanly, deliberately, placed inside the box like something that still believed it held meaning. I held it for a moment, not remembering the day it was taken, not replaying the memory, just looking at it as it existed now, incomplete, separated, accurate. There was no note, no explanation, no apology, and that told me everything. Some people don't apologize, they express damage. I placed the photo back in the box, closed it, and set it aside. Not immediately throwing it away, but also not giving it importance. Just another object waiting to be decided on. That night I went for a walk, longer than usual. The air felt different, or maybe I did. Each step felt less connected to anything behind me, less weight, less noise. At some point, I stopped thinking about her entirely, not intentionally, just naturally, like a thought that no longer had a reason to return. I reached a quiet trail outside the city. No people, no sound beyond wind and distant movement. I kept walking. No music, no phone, just the rhythm of steps that belonged to no one else. And somewhere along that path, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be described easily, just a quiet release, like something that had been holding tension for too long, finally let go. I stopped near an overlook, looked out at the distance, and for the first time, there was no comparison, no past, no what if, just presence. I took out my phone, opened the Notes app, and typed 3 words. I made it. I stared at them for a moment, not as a victory, but as confirmation that leaving had not broken me, it had restored me. I didn't need to send it to anyone, didn't need to post it, because validation was no longer external, it was internal, quiet, unshared, real. When I returned home, the apartment felt different again. Not new, not unfamiliar, just mine, completely. I picked up the box from earlier, opened it, looked at the torn photo one last time, and this time I felt nothing attached to it. No anger, no sadness, no nostalgia. Just recognition that it belonged to a version of life that had already ended. I placed it in the trash, not forcefully, not symbolically, just practically, like discarding something that no longer had use. Then I washed my hands, poured a glass of water, and sat down in complete silence. No music, no distractions, no thoughts trying to pull me backward. And I realized something simple. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It just exists when there is nothing left inside you that needs to be proven to someone else. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, not to escape, but to sit fully in that stillness. No expectations, no waiting, no unfinished conversations in my head. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. That night, I slept without interruption. No dreams pulling me back, no thoughts replaying old moments. Just rest. The kind that comes when your life is no longer divided between what is and what should have been. In the morning, everything continued as usual. Work, movement, routine. But something remained different. Not visible, not something anyone could point out. Just a steady sense of direction that didn't depend on anyone else staying or leaving. And that was enough. Because in the end, I didn't win anything. I didn't prove anything. I didn't get revenge. I simply stopped accepting a place where I wasn't valued. And in doing that, I gained something far more permanent. Myself.